Welcome to this podcast, The Good Congress. I'm your host, Brad Fitch, and I'll be walking you through a series of interviews with leading experts in Congress and democracy. The goal here is to help identify what are the principles and paths to a good Congress, explore strategies and proposals to improve congressional operations and outcomes, and hopefully build greater trust in American democratic institutions. Let's get started with today's topic and guest. Philip Wallach, author of Why Congress. Welcome to The Good Congress.
Great to be with you, Brad.
Philip is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies Americans' separation of powers and focuses on regulatory policy and the relationship between Congress and the administrative state. As I said, he just authored a book in 2023 called Why Congress, which is we're going to talk to him about today. He also, before joining AEI, he was a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, where he authored another book, To the Edge: Legality, Legitimacy, and the Responses to the 2008 Financial Crisis. He also was a fellow on the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which many people know is one of the most successful reform efforts in the last half century in working with the Congress. So, Philip, again, welcome to the podcast.
Let's talk.
Well, I want to start actually with a quote and a question about why you wrote this book. And obviously I'm a fan of the book, and for those of you who haven't read it, I strongly would recommend it. It's a very reader-friendly walk through the role of democratic institutions in America and the history in some ways written in a way that has not been written before. But in your introduction, you write quite eloquently about why Congress matters, and I'm just going to give you a quote. Americans disagree with each other. We have disparate interests, conflicting visions of the good, and divergent judgments about prudent policy. Nevertheless, we must find ways to accommodate each other in addressing the biggest problems of the day, and Congress is the place we must do it. So, why did you write this book, and why does Congress matter?
Well, I'm not a lifelong Congress scholar. There certainly are an awful lot of people like that, and I've learned so much from them. I'm a scholar of the policymaking process and the separation of powers more generally. Um, and I came to study Congress over the last 7 years or so because that's where my research has taken me in thinking about what's going wrong with America's policymaking system. Sort of a weakening Congress that's ever more marginal is really central to my sense of what's gone wrong. Congress is kind of the weak leg of our stool, and that's a big part of what's causing legitimacy problems for the federal government, in my view. So the fact that we're trying to work around Congress rather than through it is really a big part of the story of why 21st century American democracy is so fraught.
One of the things I loved about the book is the historical examples of Congress when it was functioning pretty much as the founders intended it to, and you identify specific periods around World War II and the era of passing civil rights laws in the 1960s. Can you go into a little more detail on those two examples and talk a little bit about why Congress was functioning well? What were some of the either internal or external contributing factors to a well-functioning Congress in those examples?
Sure. This is going back to a different era, World War II. You have a dominant president, and we all know about Roosevelt's importance, but I feel like most people just don't have any sense of what Congress was up to during the war. And the book tries to tell the story how Congress was really crucial for figuring out how the American people would be willing to bear the sacrifices that the war required, right? Americans did not have invaders knocking down their doors. That was the experience in the Soviet Union, of course. So rallying the Soviet people to fight the German Huns or whatever was not hard. It was literally a matter of life and death, and seething hatred. For the Americans, it was not like that, and they had to be brought in to support the war effort in careful ways that President Roosevelt was not always so good at navigating.
Hmm.
I'd say Roosevelt was kind of up at the strategic level and sort of assumed that the American people should be brought along to give them all the support that he needed. He wasn't always so sensitive to how they needed to be coaxed into it. So Congress figured out, how to distribute the tax burden, which was a big question. Roosevelt would have been much more aggressive than the Congress. Figured out how to deal with the complicated issues around price controls, controlling inflation, and also figured out how to preserve the basic sinews of the market economy that were so important to America's strength when it might have been tempting and some in the executive branch were tempted to sort of convert us more toward a command and control economy, during the war. So I think Congress's contributions are definitely secondary. They didn't they didn't fight the war. They didn't figure out the strategies, but it was a very crucial contribution, and I think it sort of goes to a theme. The old conservative Wilmore Kendall got at this very well, writing later in the 50s. Congress is kind of ideally should be sort of the earthier branch, closer to the people, kind of uh, always attuned to sort of uh, the human concerns, not always being taken with utopian schemes that sometimes attract occupants of the White House.
And I think you probably agree later on. Uh, Richard Fenno's work from the University of Rochester and Homestyle really captured that, where he traveled with, I think, 13 or 18 members of Congress over a period of years back home. And I would argue that in rereading Homestyle a couple of years ago, and I had to read it, of course, as a political science student, like we all did in college. I mean, things really haven't changed in terms when the ideal Congress is functioning really well. You called it earthier. There is this incredible connection that good members of Congress have to their constituents. There's almost an innate, almost psychic connection that the lawmakers have.
Yeah, I'd say good members listen to their constituents. They're out among their constituents in all kinds of different settings in their districts, and they take their concerns seriously. That's sort of the basic act of the politician. That like bureaucrats in the executive branch don't always have to do. Bureaucrats have a professional ethos depending on where they sit, right? They're sort of responsible to their professional community. There's all kinds of concerns they don't take seriously, kind of by the nature of being an expert, right? I know better than you. The politician takes all these concerns seriously and brings them into the political process where they have to get addressed one way or the other. And that's what's so valuable about Congress is it can be kind of a forum for harmonizing all these different concerns.
And in contrast to what some people think, that Congress should be a glorified polling organization, stick their finger to the wind and just follow constituents. And I think this was mentioned by the English parliamentarian Edmund Burke, that it is the responsibility of members not just to follow public opinion, but to intercede their own judgment. Is that not, would you not argue that they do have to use their own judgment to making decisions?
It's a delicate balance for sure between sort of being the messenger of the people and just telling what they already think and using your own judgment to determine what you think is best for your constituents and for the national interest. I think in America we do have a tradition that does favor the sort of delegate model to some extent. It's constantly in tension, I think. Um, but yeah, I think polling in particular, like in the modern imagination, is a little overrated, right? People answer poll questions, they come up with an answer, but it doesn't always get at what they really care about.
Yeah.
And I do think politicians are, in their way, a more sensitive instrument for figuring out what's really important to the citizens from their districts.
Well said. Let's continue with this walk through history. We both know that, and you write about this quite well in the book. In the 1970s, and it seems like every 50 years, Congress had this kind of urge to reform itself. Uh, there were major reforms to the committee system and to the United States Congress. There was a joint committee on the reorganization of Congress in the early 70s. First of all, what precipitated it? What was motivating members of Congress to engage in this introspective look and then reorganization of its institution?
It was definitely a struggle for power that precipitated it, right? It's a rising tide of northern urban liberals who are relatively junior in Congress and who do not want to follow the sort of apprenticeship model where they have to hang around for 15 years before they're allowed to have any real power, right? Because the people with the power in that Democratic Party that dominated Congress for so many years in the mid 20th century, the most senior members were largely Southern and conservatives, right? No two ways about it. They were conservative members. They were Democrats because all the Southerners were Democrats and had been ever since the Civil War. Uh, so the Democratic Party was a complicated coalition, and an internal power struggle within that coalition led members to say, we need to reorganize this body. And they managed to enlist Republicans in that struggle in all kinds of ways, like people like Donald Rumsfeld, for example, right? Reform-minded Republicans got together with these northern urban liberals to shake things up. And so that meant deprioritizing the seniority, right? Making it no longer a sacrosanct principle that committee chairmanships just went to the most senior members. Um, Strengthening the Democratic caucus in various ways, and most interestingly, in the 70s, really energizing this subcommittee system, which gave the sort of mid seniority level members a way of controlling an agenda somewhere where they could then hold their own hearings, get media attention, make things happen. So the Congress in the 1970s was an incredibly dynamic place. They really reinvented how the body worked. They hugely expanded its staff to basically modern size or even bigger than it is today. Largely, that was building up committee staff and subcommittee staff. Um, and it was a really happening place. They also, of course, had a sense that they needed to fight against an executive branch that had gotten too imperial, right, in its pretensions, right? So both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon did a lot as presidents that offended Congress and made it feel like it needed to fight for its institutional prerogatives. So you had that theme also working its way through in the 1970s.
Well, and that, of
Uh,
course, is going to be relevant today as we talk about bills that Congress passed in the 70s to reassert its power, specifically the Impoundment Act and the Budget Act of 74, which still guides what will be a reconciliation process that'll be coming up this year. I'll give you one anecdote to add to your explanation of what happened in the 70s. The subcommittee system, as you pointed out, uh, proliferated to a point where over 200 panels. And there was a great joke that former Congressman Mo Udall, the hilarious member from Arizona, said, and he said he'd walk down the hall and he saw a member of Congress and he didn't recognize his name. He would simply say, "Hello, Mr. Chairman," and half the time he'd be right. Uh,
right.
and that's how bad. And some could argue it's gotten out of hand. I remember reading once the new Homeland Security Department has to answer to something like 150 or 200 different panels right now, and makes the oversight so unwieldy, it's almost impossible to function.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly what happened in the 70s was there was a sense that it had all kind of become a cacophony, right? It had so many voices singing so many different tunes that even though you had huge Democratic majorities during Jimmy Carter's presidency, there was a sense that they could not all get on the same page and
Yeah.
act together. Um, and so you started to go from the 70s into the 80s into a time of uh, trying to reorganize some kind of central leadership as a more powerful force in the Congress, especially in the House, um, as a way of kind of getting a handle on this and making the House a more effective legislative instrument.
That's a nice timeline segue to my next question because I want to talk a little bit about the late 80s and early 90s and the rise of conservatives and the significant change in leadership that happened in 94. You have a chapter in your book entitled Conservatives Against Congress. And I'm going to bring in a reference to another of your colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute, Norm Ornstein, who wrote a book some years ago that you referenced, of course, with Thomas Mann called It's Worse Than You Think about Congress. And up until I read that book, I wasn't really ready to lay the blame of a dysfunctional government or dysfunctional Congress on the feet of Newt Gingrich and the Republicans. But Ornstein and Mann really make the strong case that if you go to the originations of Newt Gingrich's power, even going back to this entity he created called GOPAC in the late 80s and early 90s, that he really demonized government and Congress. You don't go for that far in your chapter. I'm not going to lay that at you. But you do have a wonderful recitation of kind of how the conservatives had this complicated um, identity as both critics and leaders in Congress at different times. Could you kind of amplify that perspective a little bit? Because it's a pretty interesting viewpoint that they almost seem, having difficulty understanding their own personality and goals.
Right. So I think you cannot understand the development of Congress in the late 20th century without dwelling on the fact that the House of Representatives was in Democratic hands for 4 straight decades, uninterrupted, right? From after the 1954 midterms until the 1994 midterms, when Republicans famously retook control, right? That's 4 decades. And you can imagine that being in the minority for 4 straight decades would profoundly shape the way members thought about their role. And so for a while, you had Republican members who had sort of found a way to thrive within the minority, right? They never get to hold the gavels. They never get to control the agenda, but they find ways of influence. So there's lots of members who fit that description who I very much admire their examples, like someone like Barbara Conable of New York is a good one. But uh, by the 1980s, when, as I said, Democrats were trying to sort of re-centralize power, they were increasingly treating Republicans pretty badly. And so you had some Republican members, Newt Gingrich most famously and most importantly, who made it their brand to say, no, we should stop cooperating as a compliant minority. We should stop accepting the breadcrumbs that the Democrats are willing to scrape off the table in our direction, and we should campaign against this corrupt institution that is Congress and the bad people who lead it and tell the American people that we will do better for them. And of course, they really did have some kinds of corrupt things that were true that they could rail against, right? I mean, the House Post Office, for goodness sake, people were selling cocaine, people were skimming cash off the side. It was gross.
The House
There
Bank.
the House Bank was a little, I think, a little less of a
Less of
genuine
a problem, but
scandal.
still, Congress never, and I was there working for a member of Congress during that scandal. What Congress doesn't fail to get sometimes is it doesn't matter that it was a semi-normal financial institution. You are getting a benefit the American public didn't get, and that's not defensible in public relations terms.
Right, right. Certainly, it looked bad, and members never found a way to justify it. It seemed like a sort of special privilege
Yeah,
that the American people do not want their members of Congress to have. So Gingrich was growing in stature throughout the 1980s as he sort of convinced his fellow Republicans that they should not go along with the Democratic majority. They should fight against it. I think the speaker, Jim Wright, in the middle of the 1980s, who Gingrich eventually took down very dramatically and chased out of Congress altogether, um, he was very imperious in the way he ran the speakership. And so I think you can't understand Gingrich's rise without understanding that he was, in fact, speaking to some real problems with the way the institution was running and a real felt sense of grievance amongst Republicans, right? He didn't just gin up these concerns out of nowhere. Um, but he did leaned pretty heavily on this idea that Congress was a corrupt body and that it needed to be cut down to size. I think in his way of thinking about the world, I think in plenty of ways Gingrich does sort of favor the presidency. So he was always talking about the line item veto as something we should do, right? And I think he definitely imagined himself becoming the president. Uh, right? I think it's important that Speaker of the House was not his terminal aspiration. But he did find himself as Speaker of the House in 1995. And I would say, yeah, at that moment, he probably was imagining sort of prime minister-like shepherding this ambitious reform agenda through the Congress, showing how effective he was and becoming the president after 1996. And I would say in that sense of how he was going to sweep through American government, he significantly misunderstood sort of what Congress is all about, and he misunderstood the nature of the coalition that he was the leader of. It was not, in fact, full of members zealous for reform. It had plenty of them, especially among the freshmen elected in 1994.
Mhm.
There really were a lot of zealous reformers who wanted to take no prisoners, but there were a lot of traditional Republicans, you know, from upstate New York or, you know, S- Los Angeles or various places who kind of wanted the show to go on, in a more favorable way to their interests, but not in a radically different way.
Oh, I think about, a member I got to know very well, Chris Shays of Connecticut, who was really the last moderate Republican. He was part of Newt Gingrich's planning team. I mean, and I've talked to Congressman Shays about that. He's got some really great stories about, being inside the room when the contract with America was being developed and put forward. And I think you characterized it perfectly that there is always, and there always has been, and in fact, even in the era of Trump, talking to individual members of Congress, there is this tension between wanting to see a very firm executive branch and a powerful president that can implement things at lightning speed,
Right.
and a traditional, more shall we say, Article 2 oriented Republican that believes that the Congress has legitimate roles, and right now their voices aren't either being heard or they're not speaking up. But I think you've adequately identified that tension.
So the word that is top of mind for me is mandate, right? Newt was a real believer that he had a mandate from the American people, and that meant he should be able to push his agenda through. Uh, and I think that's certainly one of the ways to understand the Trump administration today and a lot of its supporters. They feel there's a mandate from the American people, and that means they should get to do what they want. Um, in my view, that's really not how American constitutional government works. It's not
Yeah.
it's not a mandate system. If we wanted that, we could have a Westminster Parliament, right?
Right.
But we don't. We have a Congress that's always supposed to be about building broader majority coalitions than just the bare minimum.
And I totally agree. I really want to lecture some members of Congress and ask them, did you skip 12th grade social studies somehow and not see that part about how we are not a parliament and this is not Europe and this is not a one-party system and 51% is not a dictatorship. I mean, I won't go there. That's a little off our topic here. Let me move to modern times. One of the chapters that you write about is Congress's reaction to the pandemic. And I'm going to read you a section of your book. You give them a little credit at first, but then you wisely, I think, point out the failings that seem to be a part of their doings. And you write this: their failure to act meant that the country as a whole had no way to seek compromises, allowing different groups to get some of what they wanted. Instead, discourse centered on who was, quote, following the science, and policy responses in the states were characterized by symbolic stand taking. Dishearteningly, our political system turned COVID into just another front in our tense bipolar culture wars. I think many have argued that we have not left that era. That is still a big part, that we're still in a sort of pandemic world where the culture wars that played out during the pandemic are still with us.
Yeah. So I do think. forgive Congress a little bit just because it is tricky with so much of the um, public health powers naturally residing at the state and local levels. But I do have a sense, nevertheless, that Congress just let itself off the hook. It voted through these trillions of dollars in relief funds early on to try to keep the economy chugging along, and probably that was better than not doing that. And it was successful in keeping in having us have a very, shallow, not shallow, but a quick recovery from the recession in 2020. But they, on all kinds of hard questions about how the vaccine rollout should go, how school openings should go. They just kind of let themselves off the hook. They all yelled at each other a lot, but they never acted like it had anything to do with their responsibility of sorting out a way, a path forward. And I think there were some opportunities there. That they missed. And I think politicians all over our country really showed that they were all happy to play hot potato and not act like it was their responsibility to ask these hard questions about balancing competing things, right? Yes, safety was important, but yes, people being able to be with their sick loved ones is also important, and pray at their churches is important. And how do we balance those things? I think by and large, our politicians did not act very admirably in balancing these competing goods. They mostly uh, acted like, hair on fire one way or the other. And I think we're still suffering from that.
I agree, and I there's a lot of things I wish I could have done differently during the pandemic, and show different things that I could have done differently. But I think Congress not exercising its role, it really had a World War II moment. Not to, say that the pandemic was a good thing, but it really was a moment to put aside partisanship and recognize that so much was at stake. And it's really saddened to think that people lost their lives because of political ineptitude at times, and that's a rough thing to live with. All right, my last question. You again break some ground, I think, in congressional scholarship, where you try to look at the future. One of my complaints about many of the books on Congress, and I love Ornstein and Mann, but it's not. It's a very depressing book. It's worse than you think, And I read some of these other books, and there's just not enough investment in. Okay, great, it's broken. What do we do about it? And you have a section that outlines three potential futures: two not so great, one wonderful. Decrepitude, rubber stamp, and revival. Could you briefly describe what those three potential futures, how you see those visions, either what they look like and the good and the bad and ugly about them?
Yeah. So decrepitude is kind of the most natural course of things in my view, sort of continuing on with trends of marginalizing Congress, of working around it rather than through it. That means more executive and judicial policy making, in fact, however we pretend to square that with the statutory law on the books. Um, and yeah, it means that Congress is a place where people make showy denunciations and or do some cheerleading of the president of their own party, but nobody really expects it to be a place where real decisions are made. That's sort of yeah, the natural path. And again, I think the key there is like power abhors a vacuum. If Congress does not exercise the legislative powers that are necessary part of our government, they kind of migrate elsewhere, by hook or by crook. The the second the second scenario, rubber stamp, kind of sees a lot of the same power dynamics, but sort of more conscientiously navigated to say, okay, Congress screws everything up all the time. Let's get it out of the way. Let's demote it constitutionally. Let's give the president more agenda setting power explicitly and sort of force Congress to take the president's proposals and vote on them. So this would be sort of leaning into the mandate model, trying to actually push some reforms through that would that would make Congress more clearly subordinate. And in practice, that is likely to mean that Congress would become kind of a rubber stamp to the presidency. So it would still be formally powerful, maybe have the ability to act as some kind of emergency brake. But mostly, we would kind of all acknowledge that the president is the real center of action in American government.
Before we go into revival and end on a positive note, would you suggest that the last 2 months that we are seeing a rubber stamp Congress right now in the 119th?
To me, it's more like decrepitude,
Okay.
because they're really not right. Like we just had this fight over a CR, but the nature of a continuing resolution is that we sort of absolve ourselves of the responsibility to
Yeah.
make fresh decisions, right? We sort of coast on what was done before, and we sort of necessity assume that the executive branch is figuring a lot of things out, right? An awful lot of Republican members were happy to vote for a CR because they say Doge is going to fix it. Doge is going to get rid of all these bad things. That's going to happen through executive action, not through really anything that runs through the Congress. So I think there are a lot of Republican members right now who are acting like their job is to cheerlead what's going on in the executive branch and complain about judges who get in the way rather than making their own institution the place where these decisions
Yeah.
get fought over and then put into law where they're actually more enduring, right? The thing about executive government is when the occupant of the White House changes, if you change the party, you see this whiplash where
Yeah.
all of a sudden Joe Biden's executive orders are out the door on day one of the Trump administration. Um, if we have President Pete Buttigieg or whoever in 2029, you can expect an awful lot of the same thing to happen in the other direction. But members of Congress don't seem all that concerned, a lot of them right now. I do think you're starting to see some of them say, "Hey, maybe it would be better for us to try to bring things back into the constitutional lawmaking process." But we'll see. We'll see what happens with that.
So let's
Uh,
end on a positive note. Tell us about
okay,
revival. What does revival look like?
revival means Congress does decide that it needs to be the central place where we work through our big problems. And coming up with scenarios of how that will happen is a little bit challenging. And so I do offer one scenario where kind of, I don't know, a huge press of immigrants, Christians being persecuted in China somehow become a major uh, potential group of immigrants, and this sort of scrambles immigration politics. I don't know how plausible that is. I was, I think immigration looked like an issue capable of scrambling our politics more 10 years ago than it does today. But you need some kind of issue that shakes things up, where members are willing to say, debating this issue and making policy on this issue is more important to me than just being a good partisan foot soldier. And I'm actually willing to force hard questions onto the agenda, even when my congressional leaders find that inconvenient, and blow things open and have a big debate. And we're going to see what we can work out. And it's going to be messy, but important, right? Congress is at its best when it's unpredictable, like when we're willing to let something in and fight over it and see where the chips fall, right? We don't do a whole lot of that right now. We've allowed this pattern to come in where the leaders keep this very tight hold of the
Yeah.
agenda. They suppress any issues that are too unpredictable, and they mostly sort of keep us fighting on the lines we're familiar with. There are some issues that, trade, certainly across partisan lines, there are uh, some strange bedfellows on that. I mean, maybe foreign policy too, at this point. But I don't know what members are actually willing to go to war over, right? And sort of break out of this familiar partisan lines and do something new. I do take some amount of heart from the history, right? If you like, especially looking at the history of the first decade of the 20th century, you had a very strong party orthodoxy in the Republican Party. That was the majority party at the time. And what happens is it becomes sort of rigid and associated with certain interests and unable to adapt. And you had a faction then of progressive Republicans or more Roosevelt-aligned Republicans
Yep.
who were willing to say, well, d dash it all, regulating the railroads is actually more important than being good partisan foot soldiers for, you know, for Joe Cannon. And so they figured out how to overthrow Joe Cannon's sort of tyrannical hold on the agenda.
And Joe Cannon
And
was Uncle Joe was the Speaker of the House, and they wrested control of the Rules Committee from him, and that began the downfall of his speakership.
yes, so I think, certainly like in the ouster of Kevin McCarthy, you can sort of squint and see some ferment within the Republican Party, but it has not busted things open. It's in some ways caused even like a more tightly constrained system where we kind of all concede from the beginning that we're not really going to get much done and sort of just cling on to uh, existing lines as much as possible. There's something about the current order that seems very rigid and fragile to me, but it's gone on persisting for quite some time, really. Like, if I'm being honest, I thought that Trump in 2016 was going to shake up American politics uh, in really unpredictable ways. And frankly, it didn't. It changed what the Republican Party is all about in some ways, but it has not led to more cross-partisan, percolation of new ideas or anything. So I'm sort of still waiting for what this scenario would be that would bust things open, that would make legislators want to seize the prerogatives that really are Congress's under the Constitution. But I do believe it's a real possibility. It's latent in the system if they decide that this is their moment.
Well, Philip, you've been very generous with your time, and I deeply appreciate the wisdom and investment you've made in looking at the Congress. I look forward to your future work as you continue to delve into some of the more arcane areas and make it plain for the rest of us. So, Philip Wallach, thank you for appearing on The Good Congress.
Thanks so much, Brad.